Well, it's very nice to see all of you here today, and I hope that this will be of interest. If not, blame him. Working with bifocals is not very easy. So, beads have been with us since our ancestors lived in caves, and they can tell us much about the individuals and cultures that use them. Consequently, accurate and detailed descriptions of beads are an absolute necessity if we are to convey useful information to others that will help to date and interpret archaeological contexts. Inadequate descriptions are of little use to anyone. In the next few minutes, I will point out what needs to be recorded and how, as far as glass beads are concerned. I will not go into great detail, as most of what you need to know is in volume 24 of Beads, Journal of the Society of Bead Researchers, which is in the laboratory library. To start, we need to take a quick look at the various bead classification systems for beads that have been devised over the last century. Horace Breck, who's in the upper left corner, prepared the earliest one in the 1920s, but it was based primarily on bead forms and intended primarily for those researching ancient beads. In more recent times, researchers such as Lyle Stone and Lester Ross prepared well-organized classification systems, but these involved complex coding that was somewhat confusing and prone to typological errors. And as you can see on the left-hand side, they are rather confusing, non-informative really, and you missed the wrong key and you have a completely different variety number. The system that has found the widest acceptance, principally in Eastern North America, is that devised by Kenneth and Martha Kidd. Their taxonomic scheme for beads of drawn manufacture is extremely well organized. Unfortunately, the system for wound beads is woefully inadequate, and they do not deal with blown, mold pressed, or the rare wound-on drawn beads at all. Consequently, the bead system has not found wide acceptance on the West Coast, where these kinds of beads are quite common. I have attempted to rectify these shortcomings in my guide for the description of classification of glass beads. While the Kidd publication has been out of print for many years, it has been reprinted several times, including in the same issue as my guide. And here is the Kidd system, which most of you that have been working with me over the past few days probably know quite well by now. As many new varieties have been recorded since the Kidd system was published in 1970, a number of researchers have abandoned the system as it does not cover all the existing bead varieties, and have reverted to a random type system for classifying beads. Now, I have no problem with this if the beads are ordered in a logical manner using the Kidd system as a guide. There's nothing more frustrating to a researcher than trying to find correlatives in a report where bead varieties are presented in a haphazard manner. In other cases, it has led researchers to assign similar but not identical beads to varieties in the existing system, which does little to increase our knowledge. Rather than doing this, new varieties should be designated, placing an asterisk after the Kidd type code, followed if desired by a sequential lowercase letter for ease of reference. These would be site-specific designations. Kenneth Kidd and I had hoped to periodically update the variety lists, but unfortunately this did not come to pass. As I mentioned yesterday, one wonders about continuing that system because it's estimated that currently, including modern production, there are probably about 250,000 bead varieties out there. So it would get a little bit confusing. Now the specifics. The first step in classifying glass beads is to determine the method of manufacture. 6 methods are relevant: drawn, wound down drawn, mold press, blown, and Prosser molded. While the latter beads may more properly be described as ceramic, many have a high silica content and a glassy appearance, so have been included here. In the case of drawn beads, a hollow gather of glass is drawn out into a long tube, either by hand or mechanically, which is then segmented, and the segments are usually heat rounded. Prior to about 1817, this was done by placing the segments in a shallow pan containing a packing mixture and stirring the contents as the pan was heated over a fire. This worked for small beads. Large beads were rounded using a special method called archéo, where the tube segments were mounted on the tines of a long metal fork, which was then rotated in a furnace. After 1817, the rounding was generally done in a heated rotating container resembling a cement mixture. And that's what it looks like. So here are some examples of drawn beads. It should be pointed out that there is a group of drawn beads that have been lamp worked to insert decorative cane slices into the bead. And these are in the lower right-hand corner. These are known as flush eye beads, which date to circa 1575 to 1630. In other cases, a filament of colored glass has been applied, as you can see in the bottom row there. The kids refer to these as Roman, but why, they never explained. These are about the same age. Wound beads were produced using 2 basic methods. In one, which is illustrated here, the end of a glass rod was heated over a flame, and a filament of the molten glass was wrapped onto a rotating mandrel until the desired size and shape are achieved. Large and rather coarse beads were formed in the Fichtelgebirge region of Bavaria, which we've been talking about for the last couple of days, with a long metal mandrel being dipped into a crucible of molten glass instead of a furnace, and then winding the glass around the mandrel to form a series of beads. And here you can see a man with a mandrel in his hands with approximately a dozen or more beads on the mandrel. And the way they make these things is practically miraculous. All I could see was in the video they showed me from the 1960s was he basically turns this thing and flicks it and makes all these beads in a row. It's just almost miraculous. Large and rather coarse beads were formed in the Fichtelgebirge region, as I mentioned, with inside a furnace, and then winding the glass around the mandrel to form a series of beads. Fichtelgebirge is the only post-medieval bead-making center in Europe where furnace-wound beads were produced. So if you can find these examples of these, that's about the only place they could have come from in Europe. Now here are examples of wound beads. The surface of wound beads may be modified by the application of facets, which are designated soft when applied to to the hot glass by pressing, or hard when they're ground after the glass is cooled. The molten gather may also be pressed in a mold to impart a specific design or form. These should not be confused with mold pressed beads, which I'll talk about shortly. Molded wound beads usually exhibit swirl marks on the surface. Mold pressed beads do not. Need another drink of the vodka? Then we have the wound on drawn bead, which is a rare type presently restricted to the U.S. West Coast, where a segment of drawn tubing is heated and has an exterior layer wound onto it. The sold variety has a white core and a transparent outer layer. These are quite rare because it's a very complicated process, and one really does wonder why they went and did it when you can do it so much easier using the drawn bead method. To make mold pressed beads, a glass rod is heated in an oven and the end is snipped off and pressed in a two-piece mold. In the case of beads with complex colored patterns, two pieces of viscid glass, one in either half of a mold, were pressed together. And there you have it in the lower right-hand corner. You can basically see it along the top here and also here and there. And the reason they did that was because if they did it in a traditional manner, it would completely distort all this. Mold pressed beads generally exhibit mold seams that either extend the length of the bead or encircle the diameter. Now, blown beads may be either free blown or a drawn tube may be heated and placed in a mold. Air is blown into the tube to expand the glass and fill the mold. All blown beads are hollow, and here are some examples. The ones in the upper left-hand corner come from the shipwreck, the Arabia, which sank in the Missouri River in 1858. And it was marvelous because these were all protected. The ones in the upper right-hand corner are imitation blown beads, in imitation of coral, and they're on tie pins. And then another form is the one in the lower left, where you took a tube and then heated the center, compressed it, and pulled it apart again to create the ridges. And on the right-hand side, you see a really fancy example of the decorating technique. Now we come to the Prosser molded process, which differs from the previous ones as a cold paste consisting of crushed feldspar, sand, and other components is pressed into a large gang mold and then fired in an oven. These beads sometimes exhibit a granular appearance and often have an orange peel surface, and a distinct equatorial band frequently encircles the middle. While the process was patented in 1840, it was not applied to the manufacture of beads until 1860. And these are quite distinctive. As you can see, they are, for the most part, rather looking like glazed ceramic. And one end usually exhibits a pebbled surface indicating where it rested on the metal sheet when it went into the furnace for heating. Now, The complexity of a bead determines its class and type. The simple one, which you can see up there, is composed of a single undecorated layer of glass. A compound one, undecorated and composed of 2 or more layers of glass. It should be mentioned here that some drawn beads are flashed with a thin layer of clear glass. For the purposes of identification and classification, these are considered simple beads since the clear layer is frequently so thin that it cannot be observed without the use of a microphone. The presence of such a layer should be noted, however. And a good example is the one shown in the lower left there, which has a flashed application to the outside. Not to be confused with flashing, which is on mold press beads, where when they press the mold together, some of the glass extrudes from the edges, and that has to be knocked off, and that's called the same thing, flashing. In the complex, single layer beads with adventitious decoration, and composite, which multi-layered beads with adventitious decoration. You can see that it has a core and then a stripe. The next step is to determine the shape. The kids use very basic terms such as round, oval, and circular. The latter term has always been a bit problematic, but it refers to the form of the typical seed bead. Roderick Sprague called them torus, and I for a while tried the terms short, medium, and long barrel, but reverted to circular as it is so much simpler to use. The shape designations used by the kids may be enhanced by adding specifics such as oval, and in parentheses, olive pit shaped, or oval and peanut shaped. Many new shapes have been added to the inventory over the years, and these have been incorporated in my guide. And here are some of them. So the thing is, you should really look at my guide if you're using KID, because KID is missing most of these. And here are some more. For complex forms and multifaceted varieties, you should consult Beck's 1928 system, which really is quite extensive and useful for multifaceted beads and beads with really exotic shapes. Accurate color determination is critical for inter-site comparisons. It is unfortunate that the kids use the obscure color harmony manual to record colors which is no longer available anywhere. To alleviate this problem, I have provided the appropriate Munsell color codes in Table 1 of the kids reprint in Beads 24. The use of the Munsell color notation system is recommended. While the complete Munsell book of color retails for almost $1,000 US, the smaller Munsell color book, which is also in the lab, is priced at a more reasonable $165 US. It consists of a loose leaf binder with 10 pages of color chips with color names that record all the colors encountered so far in North American archaeological bead collections. Color determination should be done using natural daylight or daylight approximating lighting. Both incandescent and fluorescent lighting can alter the color of a bead. Beads are often patinated, which masks the original color. If possible, remove some of the patina and then wet the bead. Licking is a time-honored method among bead researchers. To facilitate an ordered inventory, Beads in each type category should be listed on the basis of their body color and decorative elements as arranged in the Mount cell system. The neutral values, like white, gray, black, come first, followed by red, yellowish red, yellow, greenish yellow, green, bluish green, blue, purplish blue, purple, and finally reddish purple. That really makes it so much easier for people who are trying to do comparative studies rather than looking all through a report for a correlative. It's also important to note the diaphaneity, which is the degree of opacity. You have opaque, which is impenetrable to light except on the thinnest edges, then translucent, which will transmit light yet diffuse it so a pin inserted in the perforation is not clearly visible, and transparent where a pin in the perforation is clearly visible. Sometimes diaphaneity will vary slightly in an otherwise like batch of beads. In such an instance, list the range, for example, translucent/opaque. Beads may be decorated with a wide, comes from my Latvian background, wide variety of elements. There are four basic categories. There's overlaid, where appliques of glass of another material either rest on or protrude noticeably from the surface of the bead. This includes painted decoration. Then there's inlaid, where the surfaces of the embedded elements are either flush with or slightly elevated above the surface of the bead. There's also internal decoration, where decorative elements such as colored cylinders, spiral bands, and metal foil are located within the body of the bead. And then you have the ground, where facets have been applied by that process. The luster of a bead should also be noted. The two most common types are shiny, which is smooth and bright, and dull, not shiny. Others that may be encountered, especially on 19th and 20th century specimens, are metallic, which have a metallic sheen, iridized, having an iridescent surface, matte, which is etched with acid, and satin, characterized by a fibrous structure. Bead measurements should be recorded in millimeters to the nearest tenth using vernier calipers. When measuring, keep in mind that the length is always parallel to the perforation and the diameter is perpendicular to it. In the case of tabular or flattened beads, in addition to the length, there's also the width, which is perpendicular to the perforation, and the thickness, which is perpendicular to the width. While measuring the perforations of common seed beads has generally not been found to be useful, in some cases drawn tubular beads will be encountered where all the physical attributes are identical, but in one the walls are thin and the perforation very large, whereas in the other the opposite holds true. These are clearly not the same variety and should be described as subvarieties. For example, 1A2 variant. Perforation size may also help segregate wound from old press beads. For example, the holes of the latter may have very small diameters, while those wound beads are sometimes quite large and tapered. 20th century drawn beads made using the mechanical mandrel drawn method may have polyhedral perforations, and this should be noted. And in the one, you have a triangular hole. In the other one, you have a square one. And these are, especially on early 20th century, late 19th century sites are very distinctive because in one case it helped to quelch the belief that some beads in Florida had been made and used during the Indian Wars, where some of the beads had these holes indicating that they really couldn't be any later than probably 1900. Beads were occasionally modified after they left the factory or workshop, generally on this side of the Atlantic, especially during the early contact period. This post-production modification includes grinding a bead to remove the exterior layers. And here you see ones as they came out of the factory, and then you have the one on the right where the outside blue layer has been completely removed so that you can see the underlying colors. Okay. Oh yes, and also another modification is burning, which should be indicated because it will frequently alter a bead's affinity, color, and shape. And these characters should always be noted. One thing that most archaeologists want to know is the time frame of their beads. Unfortunately, despite decades of research, no one has yet worked out a comprehensive chronology for glass beads found on North American sites. Fortunately, there are several regional chronologies, as well as a number of detailed reports which describe a significant archaeological collection which will help researchers date their assemblages. I cannot, of course, list them all here, but in an extensive list in my guide, I should also point out that there are 2 annotated bibliographies on North American glass trade beads on the Society of Bead Research website, as well as extensive, I'll go back to that one. Yes, and these bibliographies contain over about 2,500 annotated references, so it is a very useful tool. Another thing that most researchers would like to know is where their beads were made and who traded them. Although Venice / Murano and Bohemia produced the bulk of the glass beads that were exported to the New World, Holland, Germany, France, England, Spain, Russia, China, and likely some other nations also contributed their share. Unfortunately, there is presently no routine method for determining the country of origin for any given bead variety, but chemical analysis may eventually provide the answer. Nonetheless, where there is overlap between the kinds of beads made in the various production centers, each did have its specialties. The Venetian glass bead industry, concentrated on the island of Murano in the Venetian lagoon, was already operating as early as the 13th century and continues today. A principal product was the common seed bead, but Venice is especially famous for its elaborately decorated wound beads, as well as the famous chevron beads. And here are some typical Venetian products. The seed beads, the striped ones, chevron beads, of course, and then an extremely huge amount of decorated wound beads. Bohemia was another major bead producer and provided stiff competition to the Venetians starting in the mid-19th century. Centered in Jablonec, now Jablonec nad Nisou, in the Czech Republic, the industry produced a much wider range of beads than the Venetians, including drawn, wound, blown, and especially mold press and prosser molded varieties. And here are some examples of Bohemian products. I think that's probably fairly self-explanatory. Though hardly ever mentioned, Germany is also a major glass bead producer. The little-known town of Lauscha in Bavaria is especially noted for its bone beads. And some 70 kilometers to the southeast, in the Fichtelgebirge region, several villages were involved in the production of furnace-wound beads in a variety of forms. The products of both centers were widely distributed around the world. And you can sort of see the differences quite fine on the left, and then these rather coarse beads on the right-hand side. From around 1597 to at least 1698, Holland manufactured a variety of drawn beads. While several cities were involved, Amsterdam seems to have been the principal producer. Since the Dutch glass bead industry was initiated by expatriate Venetians, there are many similarities, visual and compositional, between the products of the two industries, making sourcing difficult. Many Dutch beads were imported into New Netherland. The French also produced glass beads, but details of the industry are still relatively obscure. A specialty begun in the 17th century was the production of false pearls. Later on, drawn seed beads were produced, principally for the production of elaborate funerary wreaths and crosses. In 1860, Felix Baptiste began the manufacture of prosser molded beads in Brière. This endeavor continued until the early 1960s. And here you have some of the specimens or examples of the beads made in France. And then one of my favorite sites, recent excavations at the Hammersmith Embankment in London, England, revealed evidence of a short-lived drawn bead industry during the second quarter of the 17th century. The recovered beads and production wasters are very similar to those excavated in Amsterdam, both in appearance and composition, making it difficult to segregate beads produced in the two centers. There also appears to have been sporadic production of wound beads during the 18th and 19th centuries, but these products seem to have been intended primarily for local consumption. China has produced wound beads for several centuries. While these made during the various dynasties have been well studied, those manufactured in the post-dynastic period are not well known due to political and language barriers. An idea of what Chinese beads looked like is provided by those attached to sewing baskets imported into North America during the early 20th century. And here are some of the examples. They are monochrome, and the glass is full of tiny bubbles, making them pretty much opaque, and that's a distinguishing feature. Spain, Russia, and possibly other countries also produce glass beads, but details are generally lacking. More research will, hopefully, reveal the missing details. Finally, we turn to the most important and interesting aspect of bead research. How did the people who own the beads we are studying value, interpret, and use them? Unfortunately, unless beads are found in situ with either deceased individuals or on an object or in a unique context, it is very difficult to determine function from unassociated specimens. While small seed beads are generally associated with embroidery, they were also used to construct bracelets, necklaces, and various other items. Likewise, large beads are generally categorized as necklace beads, and while this is often the case, it does not always hold true. Thus, to arrive at the real function of a bead, not only must its size be considered, but also the cultural, historical, and archaeological contexts. And just to give you an idea of some of these, the item on the left-hand side is a moccasin vamp from York Factory in northern Manitoba. And it was miraculously found when the soil was extremely sticky. One of the excavators walked over, and when he lifted his foot, this was underneath it. He just removed the clay from over the surface of it. On the upper right-hand corner is the wrist of an individual in Peru. And Adelphine, here are real Nueva Cadiz blues in the bottom. So you can see that from its context, it was a bracelet. And then one of my favorite usages of beads, unfortunately I didn't have this in color, it's a Seneca tobacco pipe, and the eyes are formed by red beads with the holes forming the pupils. Beads are near ubiquitous and can reveal much about how they were made, traded, and used by diverse cultures. I hope the information I have provided will enable you to better describe and interpret any beads you may encounter. And thank you very much.